Ashley is going to be our first respondent paper. She has a research. She received her BA in history and her master's of arts in teaching secondary history, both from Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. She's been teaching for more than a decade and is currently the department chair at Arlington Career Center in Arlington, Virginia. She currently teaches 11th grade dual enrollment U.S. history, where the latter is a course aligned with Northern Virginia Community College, taught at the university level, and her students earn college credits through that class. Taught grades 6 through 12 in both public and in charter schools, and has taught in Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., and now in Virginia, and has experience with both Common Core and state standards. So I'm going to turn this over to Ashley and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Courtney. So goody, I do not have a PowerPoint to share. So just so everyone's aware, I won't be screen sharing tonight. Good evening. My name is Ashley Ladner, as Courtney mentioned, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to this conference for allowing me to participate. Through 12 educator to be able to interact with historians and really work to bridge that gap between us. I think the best way to summarize what is happening in history education is to share a conversation I had with an administrator a couple of weeks ago. He asked me if I use the 1619 project in my US history classroom, and I replied, yes, absolutely. He then asked, what do you do when a parent complains? And I told him that, what will you do if someone does? And I replied, nothing, I will continue to use it. He nodded his support and then left. And the inspiration for his inquiry was that many parents in my community are against any teacher using sources such as the 1619 project and deviating from the traditional read from the textbook and answer the questions type of education. However, social studies education is changing, and in my opinion, for the better. Education in the United States has been evolving under federal programs such as No Child Left Behind under President Bush and the Every Student Succeeds Act under President Obama. Both major political parties have had their hand in dictating what students need and in how educators, who are the actual professionals in the field, should teach. The result, more often than not, is a set of mandates and standards that are produced by non-educators. History education already suffers from a lack of resources due to what texts exist or do not exist, a problem that historians also grapple with. What puts history educators at an even more severe disadvantage is that what is often provided by school districts is fueled and motivated by political causes. The most egregious example is the history textbook. Typically, these books are told with a specific narrative that supports one perspective. Students are taught a particular type of history, which often misrepresents events and minority groups. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is that Christopher Columbus, quote, discovered America, when in fact we all know he did not. Able to connect. Together, we can teach the actual history. The first step for creating this union successfully is for the historian to understand where and under what standards the educator is required to teach. For example, state standards in Massachusetts and Virginia, where I have taught, enable the educator to teach the hard history, even if parents don't like it. Even now, my district in Arlington, Virginia, the home of Robert E. Lee, American history is not whitewashed, but is instead studied authentically. My experience with composite. In that environment, the standards are more focused on a student's ability to interact with a text rather than to investigate, understand, and then critique an event in history. Many districts, such as mine, are moving towards an inquiry-based approach to history education. This means that students are presented, or sometimes create, a question that has no correct answer, such as, was the Vietnam War justified? Upon hearing this, many of us immediately have an answer. However, students would have to analyze sources that they either research or question, and then create a constructed response, personal feelings about the Vietnam War. The C3 framework, which stands for College, Career, and Civic Life, and the resources they provide are helpful for teachers pursuing this type of education because they provide driving questions and related sources with brief background and notes if needed. Teachers can then manipulate what C3 gives according to the needs of the classroom. My school in particular takes this one step further and focuses on project-based learning. One of the main differences between PBL and inquiry-based learning is that in PBL, students work in groups for all or part of the project, forcing them to collaborate and take responsibility for their own learning. The other main difference is that is in the product they create. For example, students might sometimes write a research paper, as a historian would, or they might create a Smithsonian museum exhibit, or my students love to create video PSAs. What most teachers need from historians is access to concise background information on a topic, as well as relevant primary and/or secondary sources. That way, educators can make the resources from historians work for their students' needs. It was with this lens that I read each of the papers presented this evening. As Courtney mentioned, I am also the department chair, and so I read them while also asking myself not only how I could use them in the classroom, but also how could I support my colleagues in my school and in my district. The first paper I read was The Role of Hospitals in Medieval Public Health. This paper was interesting because it focused on a time period that is either not being taught in public schools or is being presented in a very arcane way, as the author mentioned. As the paper mentions, this typical medieval lessons focus on the idea of ignorance and church dominance until the Renaissance, when, in fact, we know that was not the case. The paper focuses on two specific places and how those institutions impacted the community around them. It discusses associated primary sources and analyzes their perspectives. This combination of concise and direct background accompanied by primary sources is very useful because it can be used in a variety of ways. In order to use this paper in the classroom, I would need additional resources such as more background on the cities discussed, the church, and the political makeup. Depending on which grade level I were teaching, I would also need the historian to either provide a concise vocabulary list or adjust some of the language in the paper. High school students' literacy levels range from lower elementary to upper university, often in the same classroom, which I think is something that many of our colleagues in the university level see once the students reach university. But to see where the students start in a very low elementary level in high school can sometimes be surprising. I would also need to provide my students with relevant timelines and maps so they could understand the context that these two cities are in. The ability to look at so many aspects of medieval society within two examples is, however, very useful. Students would be able to learn a variety of concepts about life in this time period through analyses of only a few sources. This makes the overall paper a valuable resource to anyone teaching medieval history. In particular, I also appreciated the paragraph where the author discusses the perspective of the source. Specifically, the author discusses how the sources show what happened to Arsenda, but not what her motivations for joining the house were. This is particularly useful in that it shows students how to look at authorship of sources. The next paper I read was Between Flower Child and Savage. And to be honest, I was very excited about this topic. As someone who teaches US history, I know how difficult it is to find sources on Native Americans that do not denigrate or misrepresent the nations. However, I did find this paper to be more of an argument for why we should not teach the political rights narrative, which I wholeheartedly agree with, rather than a resource that I could use with my students. The author discusses an article from The Spectator and goes into detail about the issues surrounding this type of narrative. Again, I wholeheartedly agree. But I find it was a little bit troublesome that the far right was the main focus of the paper rather than criticizing both sides of the aisle. In history education, we strive to give students resources and information and then teach them how to analyze that information. From that, we encourage them to determine their own opinions on topics rather than just parroting back. And so in presenting a critique of only one side, I wouldn't be able to use this in my classroom unless I were able to find a companion critique to pair with it. I also didn't really see any actual history or focus on a usable source in this paper, which I was really looking forward to. So if the objective of the lesson is to learn about authentic Native American history, this paper would not help students support it. However, I would be very interested to see the author's resources. I would love those because I could see myself potentially using those sources in the classroom. The final paper I read was Finding the Truth in Truth. While I appreciate the author's balance of providing background rooted in sources, again, as is, I would not be able to use this in the classroom. For one thing, to be honest, would be length. This is something where high school students, again, because of academic stamina, might not be able to read through. Possibly with one of my dual enrollment courses or an AP course, of course, that would be a different story. But if I'm thinking of a standard history classroom, this would potentially be too much. For standard, in particular, I found the parts of the paper about the publisher's motivations very interesting. It would be very useful for students to see how a publisher's political motivation, in this case, either suffrage or abolition, could impact their rendering of Truth's speech and of the two versions. It would benefit students by showing how resources we have for a particular topic could be biased. And while some biases are quite obvious, we know that, some biases are not very obvious. And I thought this paper presented a very good sort of case study on how to determine that, on how to look at that by looking at those dates. If I were to use this in the classroom, I would use excerpts from the paper, but not as I mentioned, not the entire paper. And while I appreciate, obviously, the author has a wonderful understanding of Common Core, that's not the direction of social studies education that I am a part of. But I did really like at the end the lesson plan where the two speeches were side by side. Again, I find that very helpful for students, and I'm sure we all, those of us who are K through 12 educators, do this a lot when we have those companion texts side by side. It's very helpful for students. So to conclude, history education is a very intricate subject. Education itself is often influenced by politicians and administrations on both sides of the aisle, and not always for the better. As mentioned in Between Flower Child and Savage, the 1776 project is one example of how contentious teaching history, especially American history, can be. As someone who uses Zinn in the right context, and the 1619 project, I can attest to their value as educational resources. While Zinn is certainly not perfect, it is at least an attempt to tell everyone's story and not just one group's. America's educators are subject to the whims of politicians and administrations and can be deeply criticized for teaching the wrong history. For example, some parents in my district have gone after English teachers for teaching an age-appropriate version of Just Mercy because they don't agree with the book's message. In aligning with historians, however, social studies teachers could, in fact, be bolstered against such tactics. By basing lessons solely on historical artifacts and secondary sources written and/or provided by experts in the field, it can lend a certain credibility to the teacher's actions and help students to actually learn history. Many social studies educators are teaching students what they consider to be ancient history, even if it just happened 10 years ago. And many social studies educators are teaching students, and yet it is directly responsible for what is happening in the United States today. My community was put on lockdown during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And many of my students' parents and friends were there that day, working either in the federal government or in one of the many police forces in the DC area. Addressing the hard history is not only a main component of any American history curriculum, it is essential in order for our students to understand why something is happening. However, without the support of sound historical research, this can be an almost impossible task. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.